Who is the number one player for fantasy football this season? It's always a running back, Matthew, and I've got Le'Veon Bell, even with the suspension. The staff at the ESPN Fantasy Summit has Eddie Lacy. Who's your guy?
You know what? Any of those are right choices. I mean, at the moment, if I had to draft one, it's Jamaal Charles. But you can make an argument, and a legit one, for all of them. I mean, to your point about Le'Veon Bell, you look at what Le'Veon Bell, if you take away the first 3 games from last year, Le'Veon Bell's still a top 5 fantasy running back, and then Le'Veon Bell plus 3 replacement games of a guy. So I get the argument for number one there. I get the argument for Eddie Lacy, right? But then you talk about Starks coming on, and he was bad in September. Adrian Peterson, I think you can make a strong argument for him as well, but hasn't played football in a year. I think you can make an argument for Marshawn Lynch, who has been the number one running back over the last 4 years, if you combine it, right? But again, at some point, does that guy fall off of a cliff? You know, the usage numbers have been insane, and like history suggests, that kind of usage just can't be sustained. For me, it's Jamaal Charles, because you talk about any of those guys that we just talked about, Forte, Arian Foster, any of the guys that get mentioned, I feel like if you tell me one of those guys falls out the top 5, one of them falls off the cliff, Jamaal Charles to me is the least likely. You never know with injuries, of course, but to me, Jamaal Charles is the guy that has the highest floor. He's the safest. And we always say you don't have to finish the year as the number one running back to be worth the number one running back spot. Over the last 2 years, Jamaal Charles, with Andy Reid in Kansas City, has been the number one fantasy running back, just over the last 2 years combined. He's only missed 2 games. He's a focal point of that offense. We know that Alex Smith doesn't love to throw deep. Maybe Jeremy Maclin getting there opens it up a little bit more for Jamaal Charles. Ultimately, I feel like last year, I know the touchdowns were down. I think there were a couple of fluke games where Niall Davis ended up getting in. That kind of stuff, I'm not concerned about it. So for me, I have Jamaal Charles at 1 because I think he's the safest. But if ever there was a year where you want to pick in the middle or the end of the first round, I think this is it, Eric, because I like all these guys.
There's some risk with all of them, but I agree with you to some degree. Charles and I think Lacy have the least risk of all those guys. And it's interesting that we had Lacy as a staff number 1, and then Charles wasn't even in the top 2. There's so many different opinions here. You don't worry about Charles with all the new weapons there in Kansas City. I mean, they're a running team first. Alex Smith can't throw deep, but still, the upside for Jamaal Charles, he barely had 1,000 yards rushing. That's one of my concerns, is that I want my first running back to be a guy who I think can at least get 1,500 yards rushing. That's a little bit of a concern.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I hear that argument. It's how involved in the passing game do you think he is, and do you think that the touchdowns come down? I would go up, which I think they do. I think Kansas City will be a better offense this year. I think he's still the focal point of the offense. And to me, I guess he's the safest guy for me. I think he'll be a big part of what they do there in Kansas City. I mean, again, I think Maclin and a healthy Travis Kelce opens up that offense, but they're still going to run that offense through Jamaal Charles. And you have to get nitpicky, right? I mean, with Eddie Lacy, I have Eddie Lacy at 2. So, but for me, again, the poor September, and anytime you have Aaron Rodgers, he's always a threat to throw as opposed to passing. They were using Stark some, keeping Lacy fresh for the playoffs. There were times where Lacy wasn't getting more than 15 touches in a game, and which is fine. I mean, listen, Charles is a guy that they keep touches down to, but Charles is a guy that doesn't need a ton of touches to be effective. Lacy, if he's not scoring, needs them. Charles is one of those guys that all he needs is a hole, and he can make your fantasy day in one play. Lacy's not really that kind of a guy. He's more of a bruiser. He's more of a guy that needs volume.
All right, so if you get the first pick, that's great.
They're all great guys. You're nitpicking
here. The 7th pick, that's what you want to have this year. That's the real story.
Yeah, no,
pick later.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't even get to DeMarco Murray or LaShawn McCoy. There's a lot of guys, Jeremy Hill, we all expect to have a big step up this year as well. C.J. Anderson, if he's the guy in Denver. So there's a lot of guys. I think the big story is whoever you have at number, whatever, I want to pick late in the first round, not at the top, because there's a bit of a sameness all there at the top.
And I want to get my second running back in round 2, and maybe one of these guys will fall. So very interesting this season, not like any other season, with the running backs at the top of the first round.